My name is Lowell and welcome to the channel. So we've got a very interesting video for us today. So this is going to be from the YouTube channel Name Explain with where did the Aussie accent come from? So as you can tell, I do sound Australian. Australian is not my first accent actually. I actually come from Scotland originally. Moved to Australia when I was a kid, so I actually had a Scottish accent first. So I was teased, wanted to sound Australian. That's what I sound like now. So this is going to be very interesting. So let's jump in and let's go. Where did the Australian accent come from? Very interesting. Let's have a
Support
listen.
Name Explain on Patreon for ad-free videos, exclusive podcasts and blog posts, and to help choose what names get explained. Click the link in the description. Accents are weird things, aren't they? Like, I understand why different people from around the world end up speaking different languages, but why on earth have people ended up sounding different depending on where they come from? Why do specific places affect the way we speak? It seems that accents come about when people have been living together for a long enough period of time and pick up on specific speech patterns from one another until eventually everyone in the community speaks in a similar way. Accents are way more than just the way we speak, however. Not only can an accent signify where we come from, but it can also signify what socio-economic background we come from too. In example, a rich person and a poor person from the same part of London will most likely speak differently. They're truly fascinating things. This has of course led to some accents being more beloved than others. Undoubtedly, however, one of the most beloved accents has to be the one this video is all about, that being the dialect spoken by those from the land down under, the Australian accent. It really is one of those accents that pretty much everyone knows straight away, and everyone has attempted to do it themselves with varying degrees of success.
It's funny. I lived in the UK for 10 years. I got New Zealander. I got South African, Welsh at one point. I don't know. I don't know if it's quite as recognizable maybe as first thought. I don't know.
What I find most interesting about this accent is that it's not entirely native to the land. The modern nation of Australia is primarily made up of descendants from settlers from other parts of the world, much like other nations like the USA or Brazil. This is different to many other nations, which have inhabitants that have lived there for many years and have accents that are native to the land, like French and Irish in example. So where exactly did the Australian accent come from? To start with, the official language of the nation should give you a pretty clear idea as to where this story begins. While Aussie speak English, Australian English has very much become its own unique thing. Not only do they speak English, but the Union Jack is part of their flag too. If you haven't guessed by now, Australia and the United Kingdom are very much interlinked nations. Australia was in fact a colony of the British Empire from 1788.
Obviously, everybody knows this is where England sent their criminals, not just obviously Britain sent their criminals
Until
to Australia.
1901. This explains to us not only why they speak English, but also shows us how exactly that famous accent started to take shape. As mentioned, the British colonization of Australia started in 1788. It was in this year that the famous First Fleet arrived in the continent. This fleet of 11 ships left Portsmouth in the southeast of England on the 13th of May 1787, carrying over 1,000.
That's pointing to between Melbourne and Adelaide. It wasn't. It was Sydney they first came.
400 inhabitants to their new home. At this time, Australia had no European settlements, so making the land habitable was quite the challenge for the people on these ships. On these 11 boats were a huge variety of people. There were high-ranking government and military officials who'd be running the operation once they landed in Australia, but these officials brought their families with them too. On top of this, you had the ship's crew members, but also people who'd fill important roles once they arrived in the land, like builders, cooks, and various other workers, though most famously of course are the convicts on these boats too. There were thought to be around 700 to 800 convicts aboard the 11 ships of the First Fleet. They were being sent to Australia simply due to the growing amount of prisoners in Britain. This is something we covered in much more detail in our video about Tasmania's strange name, so go check that out. To summarise, the British Empire used Australia as a plaster for their prisoner problem, rather than fixing the problem outright. Australia wasn't just a dumping ground for Britain's convicts, as various stereotypes like to depict. Regardless as to why there were convicts in Australia, they definitely were there, as well as many other people, from fancy government officials and their fancy families to other various workers who were enlisted to create this new colony. All these people would have come from different parts of Great Britain and would have come from different social economic backgrounds too. This meant that not only did this huge variety of people arrive in Australia, but their huge variety of accents arrived in the land too. Great Britain is home to many accents and dialects, despite its relatively small size. One source pointed out that there were up to 300 different accents on this island. These changes in voice can be seen on a large scale when comparing someone from the north of England to someone from the south. However, there are even slight differences in the way people speak in counties right next to each other. Even people from different boroughs of London can speak differently. It's an island full of a staggering amount of accents, and an awful lot of these accents made their way over to Australia with the First Fleet. In the 18th century,
It's funny how it's only what 200 short years. It went from that amalgamation of all these different accents to what we speak now in Australia. That's very quick turnaround.
people didn't travel as
Very
much as they
quick.
do now, especially people from lower economic backgrounds. This meant that many of these people may have never heard some of these other British accents before, let alone understand them. Communicating with
You never really think of that, do you? Like they don't travel, so they may not have heard a Welsh accent or if you're from England, a Scottish accent. That's interesting. I never thought of that before. Okay.
one another became quite a
Okay.
challenge, and when you are literally on the opposite side of the earth trying to create a new community from scratch in the blazing Australian heat, you kind of need to be able to communicate with one another efficiently. From the fact that Australia is still around to this day, we can gather that these various people did manage to communicate with one another, despite the disparities in their dialect. How did they do this, however? Well, something happened to the way in which these various British people spoke their language. This something is known as dialect levelling. Dialect levelling is something that happens in the world of language and linguistics, in which various distinct variations of a language strip away the things that make them distinct for ease of understanding. Words
Okay.
present in one dialect but not in another would be removed, and other words that are pronounced differently in different accents would be levelled out and be said in a way that fits all the different dialects and accents. Removing all these quirks and traits in a language and getting to the bare bones of it really help people who speak the same language but in vastly different accents and dialects communicate with one another, and this is exactly what happened in Australia and set the
I always thought of an Aussie accent as English kind of stripped back. Maybe that's what it is.
wheels
Okay.
in motion for the birth of the Aussie accent. This birth didn't happen overnight, however. It was after 50 years from that initial European settlement of Australia that the accent that we all know and love started to appear. Those initial settlers still alive after 50 years would have undoubtedly changed the way they spoke, but the real change of the
50 years is not very long. That doesn't sound very long at all to change a whole accent. Wow.
accent would have come with descendants, the kids and grandkids of the initial settlers who would have spent their entire life in the accent melting pot that Australia had become. These children would have really sounded how Australians sound today. Of course, it was a huge mixture of
Wow.
accents that went into the creation of the Australian accent we have today, though some dialects and accents are seen as being a bit more pivotal and had a larger influence in the sound of the speech today. It seems that the South East English accent is seen as one of the key players in the Aussie accent. This makes an awful lot of sense. The First Fleet left from Portsmouth, which is in the southeast of England, and the southeast is one of the most popular parts of the country. The southeast houses London, so many important figures and convicts on these boats would have arrived from the capital. More specifically in London, we have the Cockney accent too.
Yeah.
Cockney is seen very much as the precursor of the Australian accent. There are definitely similarities between the two.
I could see that Cockney. They use a lot of slang in Cockney as well. So maybe that's where we picked up our use of slang. We definitely like slang words here. We like to shorten everything as well. Yeah, it's too hot to talk properly.
Too, that's for
Too hot.
sure. Likewise, Scottish is seen as having
Scottish,
a
yeah.
large influence on the
Yeah.
Australian accent too. However, there's one huge omission I haven't mentioned in this video yet, and that's the native accent of the Australian Aboriginals. I've read conflicting things as to whether their accent affected the Australian accent. Some say it had a direct impact on the way Aussies speak, while other sources point out that it's the other way around. While Aboriginal names and words are very present across Australia, it seems that accent isn't quite as abundant. accent. Pretty much as soon as the accent emerged, it was instantly beloved. What's even more surprising is that when it first came about, Australian English and their Australian accent was seen by scholars of the time as the purest form of the English language. This purity of the Australian accent goes back to the dialect levelling we mentioned earlier. The people of Australia had come to speak English without any of the local quirks that plague the various forms of
See, that's what I was talking about, but it being stripped back, like almost like a base language. It's funny how it took 50 years to develop, to change, but it didn't keep changing. It got to that one point and then that was it. It didn't develop anymore. It didn't kind of change anymore. And it's been the same for what, 150 years now. So interesting. The purest. Okay, I could see that. As I said, that stripped back kind of. Okay.
English spoken in the
Okay.
UK, all because this accent and way of speaking was born out of a means to communicate easily and efficiently. Author of The Story of Australian English, Kel Richard, explained it best, saying that Australian English is English with the dialect variations taken out. Unfortunately, this love of the Aussie accent and its position as the purest form of English wouldn't stay around for too long. Across the 18th and 19th century, some huge changes were made to the English language and the way in which it was perceived. The most noticeable change was the introduction of the concept of received pronunciation, known as RP for short. RP is named by many other names: BBC English, the Queen's English, and Oxford English.
Posh English is what we call it here. Posh.
To name a few examples, it's that definitively British accent spoken by the likes of the Queen and those who present the news on BBC. It was in this period of time that RP was put on a pedestal and declared the definitive way of speaking the language. Not only was it seen as the definitive way of speaking English, but those who spoke with this kind of accent were seen as superior to other English speakers. Those who didn't speak like this in not just the UK but across the empire in general were looked down upon. It's worth noting here that despite being seen as the stereotypical way in which British people speak to this very day, very few British people actually speak in RP on a regular everyday basis. It's pretty much just the royal family and the rest of the upper echelons of British society.
Yeah, as I said, I lived in the UK for 10 years. I never met anybody who spoke like that. That real proper posh English. Nah.
Society at this point. Despite this, however, it meant that the once beloved Australian accent had gone from being seen as the purest form of English to being a rather harsh, rough, and coarse accent. Sorry, Australia. Soon enough, RP was being taught in classrooms all across the empire, including Australia. Not only were young Aussies being taught to speak like this, but many posh Aussies started to use RP too, to distance themselves from their traditional Aussie accents, what was seen as unpleasant sounding in the time. Even once the country gained its independence from the UK in 1901, people were still trying to speak with an RP accent and sound less Australian. All this brings us to today. Luckily nowadays there
I even in Australia, I've never heard anybody speak like that.
isn't as much stock put into RP, and by and large people aren't shamed or judged for the accents they have, at least they shouldn't be anyway. Luckily for us, RP's boost in popularity in the 19th century didn't wipe out the Aussie accent. Though what's so interesting about this dialect is that in its roughly 200 years of existence, not many variations of the accent have actually emerged. There are a few variations of the Australian accent, and the variations that do exist aren't particularly related to geography, like the accents of the UK or USA in example.
That's the thing. People say, "Oh, there's different types of Aussie accents." I couldn't tell you, speaking to somebody, if they came from Melbourne or they came from Perth or they came from Darwin. I couldn't tell you. Not like if somebody comes from Boston or somebody comes from Alabama in America, you'd be able to tell straight away. You'd be able to tell if somebody comes from England or somebody comes from Newcastle, in England. But in Australia, I couldn't tell you, and I speak Australian. I don't know. I could not tell you where they came from in Australia.
The Aussie accent really doesn't change that much depending on where you are from. Most sources claim that there are just 3 different versions of the Aussie accent, and these are more defined by socio-economic backgrounds as opposed to geographic backgrounds. These 3 are called general, broad, and cultivated. General Australian is by far the most common Aussie accent you hear. It's the way in which the vast majority of the nation speak. Someone like Hugh Jackman is a prime example of this kind of Aussie accent. Broad Australian is the accent spoken by people living in more rural areas, part of the nation that are more isolated and would have been less affected by RP and its influence in the 18th century. A great example of a broad Australian accent is with Steve Irwin. Cultivated Australian is perhaps the least Australian sounding of these three variations. It seems this accent is most linked with the high society of Australia.
Melbourne, probably, I would say.
Those whose ancestors did in fact pick up on RP all those years ago. I read that Kate Blanchett
Yeah,
is a
Kate
prime
Blanchett.
example of someone with a
Somebody who sounds posh or trying to sound posh.
cultivated Australian accent. In all honesty, I didn't even know she was an Aussie. The history of this accent is an interesting one, that's for sure. From being born out of necessity for easy communication between people from vastly different backgrounds, to being considered the pinnacle of English, to being shunned thanks to RP, to being the beloved accent it is to this day. It's even evolved more so to become its own thing, with unique Australian words and phrases. In fact, you could call this form of English and the accent sweet as bro. That's what they say in
No, that's Kiwi. We never say sweet as. That's Kiwi.
Australia, right? Thank you to
No.
all my patrons who support Name Explain on a monthly basis.
No, that is not what we say in Australia. Sweet as is that's Kiwi. That was very interesting. Very interesting. Kind of obviously knew the British was going to have the influence here, but that way that it was for that ease of communication, which is obviously what it's all about as well. You can't have a new place, a new colony, if you can't understand each other. You can't communicate. So it's funny how it changed in 50 years, but since then hasn't changed at all. There's that kind of three variations of it. But like I said, I couldn't tell you if somebody was from Brisbane or somebody was from Melbourne or somebody was from Darwin. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you by the accent. They all sound exactly the same to me, apart from somebody who tries to sound posh. Maybe somebody who's a little bit more rural will just maybe talk a little slower. They're not in a hurry. But far as dialect or completely different accents like they have in America, like they have in the UK, it doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen. Maybe somebody from outside of Australia you could hear the difference. But living here and speaking it, I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell you the difference. But that was very interesting. Very interesting how accents can happen, how it can change, and how those children are born, naturally speaking that. Very, very interesting. I like that one. I like that one. It was very interesting to see where that accent comes from, which we actually speak in Australia. As I said, not my first accent, but the one I'm currently got. So guys, let me know if you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for joining me today. Make sure you stay safe, and I'll definitely see you in the next reaction video.